The chamber was loud, buzzing with the usual chatter and partisan performance, until Jasmine Crockett leaned forward and dropped a single question that cut sharper than a blade. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dressed up in theatrics, it was delivered with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike. And in that instant, the room shifted. Faces that had been smug only seconds earlier froze in disbelief. The practiced confidence of GOP members drained into silence, as if the oxygen itself had been sucked away. Their talking points, so often rolled out like a machine, polished and rehearsed, suddenly looked flimsy, exposed, and broken. One question had done what hours of debate could not: it revealed the emptiness beneath the bluster. Viewers at home sat forward, stunned. Social media lit up in real time, fingers racing across keyboards to capture the moment. Did she really just say that? The clip began to spread before the hearing had even ended. What made the question so devastating wasn't its volume but its clarity. Crockett hadn't just poked holes in their argument, she had pulled the entire thread, unraveling the fabric of a narrative the GOP had built for years. The silence after her words was louder than any applause. Eyes darted, papers shuffled, a forced cough broke the tension, but no one rushed to answer. Because how could they? How could a party that prided itself on discipline and strength suddenly find itself unmasked by a freshman voice they had dismissed as irrelevant? And yet that was the genius of the moment. Crockett's question wasn't just a rebuke, it was a mirror, held up for the nation to see. It forced the GOP to confront what they had long avoided. It forced America to ask, how could one question dismantle an entire party's talking points? But the true power of that question wasn't only in what it revealed in the present. It was in what it carried from the past, the weight of stories, struggles, and contradictions that made this moment inevitable. And when you understand the road that led here, the impact becomes even more explosive. Because this wasn't an accident. It was destiny colliding with arrogance. The lead up to that single question was years in the making. The GOP had walked into the hearing with the kind of swagger that comes from believing the game is already won. They had the microphones, the headlines, and the weight of repetition on their side. They believed their narrative, crafted through sound bites and cable news appearances, was untouchable. Every attack was rehearsed, every dismissal sharpened for maximum sting. For too long, these hearings had been their stage. They used them not to uncover truth, but to perform power. To paint themselves as guardians of integrity while burying their own hypocrisies beneath layers of outrage. It was a pattern that had worked. Interrupt, dominate, ridicule, and eventually the other side would buckle under the noise. It wasn't a debate, it was theater designed to exhaust. But this wasn't theater for Jasmine Crockett. For her, it was something more. Because behind their arrogance, she saw the stakes. She knew these moments weren't abstract political games, they rippled into the lives of everyday people. When truth is dismissed, it means working families lose their voice. When arrogance drowns out accountability, communities pay the price. When leaders choose performance over honesty, democracy itself begins to fracture. And that was why the silence after her question mattered so deeply. It wasn't just about scoring a point, it was about breaking through years of suffocating noise. At that moment, the polished certainty of the GOP collided with the raw weight of truth. For ordinary Americans watching, it was validation. How many times had they been dismissed by bosses, politicians, or institutions? How many times had their dignity been trampled by those who believed power gave them the right to decide what mattered? Crockett wasn't just speaking as a congresswoman, she was speaking as a reflection of millions who had been told their voices didn't count. The GOP, in their overconfidence, hadn't seen it coming. They assumed another day meant another easy win. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most disciplined players. They underestimated not only Crockett, but the moment itself. And that is what made her question seismic. It exposed the hollowness of the performance and reminded the country that truth, spoken with clarity, can pierce through even the loudest noise. It wasn't simply a congressional clash, it was a reminder of what's at stake: justice, dignity, representation. For the immigrant parent silenced in a workplace. For the young activist told to wait their turn. For the communities written off as irrelevant. This was their victory too. Still, no one in that room or in the millions of homes watching could have predicted just how far Crockett would take it. Because while the GOP thought they had cornered her, she was holding the card that would flip the script in one breathtaking instant. And when she played it, the result would not just silence her opponents. It would leave the entire country asking how one voice could shake the foundation of an entire party. But no one expected Crockett to flip the script with just one question. The GOP walked into that chamber with the air of seasoned performers stepping onto a familiar stage. Their suits were sharp, their smiles rehearsed, their sound bites already prepared to be clipped for prime time. To the casual eye, they seemed untouchable, commanding, certain, masters of the political theater. But underneath the polish was something more fragile: insecurity wrapped in arrogance. For years, they had perfected the art of speaking loudly while saying very little. Their strategy wasn't built on facts but on force. Interrupt, posture, mock, and repeat until the other side looks overwhelmed. They called it strength. They branded it conviction. But to anyone paying close attention, it was a theater hiding a hollow script. Take their rhetoric on accountability. They demanded transparency from their opponents, yet shielded their own allies from even the simplest scrutiny. They railed against corruption, yet their own records were dotted with sweetheart deals, donor favors, and partisan double standards. They thundered about family values, yet tolerated scandals within their own ranks. The contradiction was glaring, but arrogance gave them confidence that no one could, or would, call it out in a way that mattered. And arrogance is a dangerous shield. It convinces leaders that performance is the same as principle, that bullying is the same as strength, that silence from the other side is proof of victory rather than patience. So when the GOP saw Jasmine Crockett on the roster, they smirked. To them, she was inexperienced, junior, untested, a freshman to be brushed aside. What they didn't understand was that their dismissiveness revealed more about them than it did about her. Their need to belittle was born of fear, the fear of authenticity, of someone who couldn't be bought, of someone who hadn't marinated long enough in Washington's games to be predictable. Crockett was an unknown, and the unknown is always a threat to those who rely on control. In their minds, they still held the upper hand. They had the louder voices, the longer resumes, the media presence to shape narratives before the dust even settled. And with each interruption, each smirk, each carefully planted insult, they believed they were tightening their grip on the hearing. To them, this was routine: dominate the stage, leave their opponents flustered, walk away with the headlines. But arrogance always leaves cracks. And the GOP, in their eagerness to perform dominance, failed to see how thin their armor had become. Every contradiction in their records, every hypocrisy in their behavior, every dismissal of dignity, they were carrying all of it into that chamber like baggage they thought no one would dare to unpack. That was their fatal mistake. Because Crockett wasn't intimidated by polish. She wasn't distracted by theatrics. She saw the cracks for what they were, proof that behind the volume, behind the arrogance, there was nothing of substance holding it together. The GOP believed they were untouchable. They believed they were dealing with a junior. What they didn't know was that their performance had finally met a mirror sharp enough to shatter it. And just when they thought they had the upper hand, a freshman Congresswoman shattered it all. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the halls of Congress, her life was already a testament to resilience. She didn't arrive by privilege or family name, she arrived by grit, sacrifice, and a relentless belief in justice. To understand why her question hit so hard, you have to understand the story behind it, the story of a woman who had been underestimated long before a GOP member tried to do it on national television. Crockett grew up knowing what it meant to fight for dignity in spaces that weren't built to welcome her. She was the daughter of a working-class family, a child of a community that had seen more struggle than ease. While others were born into networks of influence, Crockett was born into a network of survival neighbors who looked out for one another, parents who taught her that your voice matters even when the world tries to silence it. Her journey into law wasn't about prestige. It was about purpose. She became a public defender, not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. Day after day, she stood beside people written off by the system, people who didn't have the money, the status, or the influence to protect themselves. She learned how to fight in courtrooms where the odds were stacked, where the rules seemed rigged, where the powerful always had an edge. That crucible taught her something no textbook could, that truth, spoken with courage, has power even when the system is against you. By the time she entered politics, Crockett had already lived the battles most politicians only reference in speeches. She had walked with the marginalized, defended the voiceless, stood against injustices that never made it to headlines. Her candidacy wasn't about ambition, it was about representation. She ran not to join the club, but to disrupt it. And when voters sent her to Washington, they didn't send her to play along. They sent her to bring the grit of her community into the polished chambers of power. That's what the GOP didn't see. They looked at her and saw Junior. They saw someone new, someone they could dismiss. But what they missed was that Crockett had already survived battles that make political grandstanding look like theater. They had no idea that the fire she carried wasn't from politics, it was from lived experience. Her calm in that hearing wasn't passive. It was the composure of someone who had faced worse and endured. It was the patience of a woman who knew the weight of silence, the strength of listening, the power of timing. While others rushed to prove themselves, Crockett understood that sometimes the greatest power is holding back until the exact right moment. And when that moment arrived, she didn't flinch. She didn't stammer. She didn't try to meet arrogance with arrogance. Instead, she wielded her life's lessons like a blade, sharp, precise, devastating. Her question wasn't just political. It carried the weight of every courtroom where she had defended the defenseless, every fight where she had been told she couldn't win, every moment when she had been underestimated and refused to shrink. That's why the audience felt it so deeply. It wasn't simply a freshman taking on the establishment. It was the story of the underdog written into reality, live on national television. Crockett embodied the countless voices that had been silenced, the countless faces dismissed as unworthy, the countless communities told to wait their turn. Her rise was their rise. Her defiance was their defiance. Her victory was theirs. And while the GOP carried contradictions and hypocrisy into that chamber, Crockett carried something far more powerful: authenticity. In a political world addicted to performance, she was real. She wasn't there to posture or pretend, she was there to tell the truth. And when truth stands against arrogance, the outcome is inevitable. Her backstory explains why the silence that followed her question felt so seismic. It wasn't the silence of confusion, it was the silence of realization. The realization that they had underestimated not just Crockett, but the millions she represented. The GOP had dismissed her as a junior. But in that moment, she wasn't junior, she was the embodiment of every outsider who fought to be heard. She was the voice of every immigrant family striving for dignity, every young leader told to wait, every marginalized community demanding justice. And that is why the stage was set for something unforgettable. Crockett wasn't just ready for the fight, she was destined for it. Because the truth is, when someone who has been underestimated their whole life finally gets their chance to speak, the world doesn't just listen. The world changes. And in the next heartbeat, the clash of arrogance and authenticity would erupt into a moment so explosive, it would leave even her opponents stunned. The chamber was already thick with tension, but as the exchanges wore on, the atmosphere turned electric. The GOP had grown comfortable, leaning back in their chairs, layering interruption upon interruption as if sheer volume could substitute for truth. Their voices rose, their smirks widened, their dismissive comments aimed like darts across the table. They believed they had Jasmine Crockett cornered, boxed into the role they'd scripted for her. Quiet, deferential, forgettable. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She sat steady, her pen resting lightly on her notes, her gaze calm but unwavering. Every barb thrown her way only highlighted the contrast, one side frantic and loud, the other composed and resolute. And while the GOP mistook her composure for weakness, it was, in fact, the silence before the storm. One Republican leaned in, gesturing broadly, voice dripping with condescension. He repeated the same talking points that had echoed in hearing after hearing, attacks framed as questions, accusations masked as inquiry, all designed to provoke rather than illuminate. The words rolled out with theatrical confidence, but to anyone paying attention, they sounded rehearsed, hollow, almost desperate. Crockett tilted her head slightly, listening. Not interrupting, not flinching. Just listening. And in that silence, the imbalance grew clearer. Their arrogance began to look less like strength and more like insecurity bleeding through. Viewers could feel it, the shift in momentum, the sense that something was about to snap. Then came the dismissals. One GOP member leaned back and chuckled, calling her junior. Another mocked her background, implying she was unseasoned, out of her depth. The word hung in the air like an insult passed between old boys at a country club, dripping with entitlement and disdain. It wasn't just disrespect for Crockett, it was disrespect for everyone she represented. And that was the breaking point. The room could feel it. The casual cruelty of that label didn't diminish her, it ignited her. The chamber quieted for a moment, perhaps sensing that their arrogance had pushed too far. And Crockett, still calm, still steady, leaned forward. She hadn't raised her voice, but her presence expanded. It was as if the room itself shifted toward her. The escalation wasn't just verbal, it was emotional, symbolic. On one side, the forces of arrogance and dismissal. On the other, a woman carrying the weight of lived experience and the dignity of those who sent her there. The GOP had turned up the volume, but Crockett was about to turn up the truth. She opened her mouth, her tone measured, deliberate. Every syllable cut through the noise like a blade slicing fabric. She didn't match their arrogance with bluster, she dismantled it with clarity. The escalation had reached its peak not because of how loudly they spoke, but because of how sharply she was about to respond. And in that rising tension, the chamber held its breath. The insults had been hurled, the arrogance displayed, the stakes made clear. The GOP believed they had asserted dominance. But what they didn't realize was that all their noise had only built a stage for Crockett's next move. The air hung heavy, waiting for her to drop the question, the one that would turn this entire exchange on its head. Because in a matter of seconds, everything they thought they controlled would unravel. The chamber had grown so used to the GOP's rhythm, the interruptions, the grandstanding, the smug certainty, that when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her stillness hit harder than any raised voice. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She simply paused, eyes fixed on the men who had just tried to shrink her with a single word, Junior. That silence stretched, thick and unyielding, until even the loudest members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. And then it came. The question. Crisp. Surgical. Delivered without hesitation, a direct challenge that pierced through layers of talking points like a knife through paper. She asked not with anger, but with precision, demanding accountability on a policy the GOP had paraded as proof of their so-called principles. In a single sentence, she exposed the contradiction they had spent months trying to disguise. The room froze. For the first time that day, their confidence cracked. Eyes darted. Papers shuffled. One Republican, who moments earlier had been smirking, suddenly found something fascinating at the bottom of his notes. Another leaned toward a colleague, whispering as though the answer might be scribbled somewhere between their talking points. The question was so simple, so obvious, and yet so devastatingly unanswerable. And Crockett didn't stop there. She let the silence linger just long enough for the discomfort to settle, then pressed again, this time adding context, tying their rhetoric to their record, forcing them to confront the yawning gap between what they preached and what they practiced. Every word was a scalpel, cutting away the veneer of authority they had built around themselves. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a dismantling. One by one, their contradictions were laid bare. They claimed to stand for fiscal responsibility, yet she named the bloated contracts they'd quietly approved. They thundered about law and order, yet she cited their refusal to hold their own accountable. They wrapped themselves in the language of freedom, yet she pointed to their votes that stripped freedoms away from ordinary Americans. Each reveal landed like a blow. Each fact left them further exposed. And the beauty of it all? Crockett didn't raise her voice once. Her calm was her weapon. Her composure was her power. The more they squirmed, the more devastating her delivery became. In that chamber, she was no longer the junior they mocked, she was the teacher, and they were the students caught unprepared. Viewers watching at home could feel the shift. Social media lit up in real time. Did she just say that? She's cooking them alive. That question will haunt the GOP for years. Hashtags started trending before the exchange even finished. Memes appeared within minutes, capturing the stunned faces of Republican leaders caught flat-footed. What they had expected to be another routine performance had transformed into the very spectacle they feared most: exposure. And exposure is unforgiving. The GOP scrambled to respond, fumbling through excuses and recycled slogans, but the damage was already done. Each attempt to spin only made their weakness more obvious. Their bluster, once intimidating, now looked hollow, even pathetic. The louder they got, the smaller they seemed. Meanwhile, Crockett doubled down, not with cruelty, but with clarity. She framed her counterattack not as a personal victory, but as a defense of the people who had been silenced for too long. She invoked the voices of working families, of immigrants striving for dignity, of communities neglected by the very leaders who now sat squirming under her question. She made it clear, this wasn't about her. It was about justice. It was about truth. It was about holding the powerful accountable when they thought they were untouchable. And that's why it hit so hard. Because at that moment, Crockett wasn't just speaking as one Congresswoman. She was speaking as a vessel for millions of Americans who had been waiting desperate for someone to look arrogance in the eye and not blink. The mic drop wasn't just the question. It was everything the question represented: courage against intimidation, authenticity against performance, dignity against disdain. It was the moment when a so-called junior reminded the nation that truth doesn't care about seniority. As her words settled, the chamber fell into a silence more deafening than any shout. It wasn't the silence of victory speeches or routine decorum. It was the silence of defeat, the kind that lingers when a facade crumbles in public view. The GOP had nothing left to say, and everyone knew it. And Crockett? She leaned back, composed as ever, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. Not smug, not gloating, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had done exactly what she came to do. The clash was over. But the aftershocks were only beginning. Because what happened in that chamber wasn't going to stay in that chamber. It was going to ripple outward into headlines, into social feeds, into living rooms across the country. The moment the GOP had tried to dismiss as insignificant was about to dominate the national conversation. And just when the Republicans thought the worst had passed, they were about to realize the true scale of what Crockett had unleashed. The moment Jasmine Crockett dropped her question, the hearing itself became secondary. What lingered wasn't just the words, it was the silence that followed, the stunned expressions frozen on the faces of GOP members, the unmistakable sense that something irreversible had just happened. But the real explosion came after, far beyond the walls of that chamber. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media. A 10-second video of Crockett's question, paired with the GOP's fumbling silence, spread like wildfire. On TikTok, creators remixed the moment into everything from comedy skits to motivational montages. On Twitter, hashtags shot to the top of the trending list, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag Junior no more, hashtag truth bomb. Each one pulled more eyes toward the confrontation. Each one amplifying the ripple effect. News outlets scrambled to keep up. Commentators who had dismissed Crockett as a newcomer just weeks earlier now ran segments calling her the breakout star of the hearing. Late-night comedians pounced on the footage, looping the GOP's blank stares with punchlines that wrote themselves. Even morning shows, usually cautious with politics, couldn't resist replaying the mic drop moment for their viewers, framing it as a rare instance of truth cutting through Washington theater. But the shockwaves weren't just media-driven. Ordinary people, immigrants, young activists, working parents felt something deeper. They saw themselves in Crockett's composure, in her courage, in her refusal to shrink under pressure. For many, it wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. A comment on one viral clip read, "She spoke for every one of us who's ever been told we're too young, too inexperienced, too small to matter." Another wrote, "That one question had more truth than an entire year of GOP hearings." And perhaps most telling were the reactions inside the political world itself. Progressive leaders praised her fearlessness, hailing her as a rising star who embodied the next generation of leadership. GOP members, meanwhile, scrambled to downplay the moment, some pretending not to remember, others accusing the media of exaggeration. But denial only made the video circulate faster. Every attempt to minimize the impact only proved how rattled they really were. The shockwaves reached beyond Washington. At college campuses, students organized watch parties to stream the hearing clips, cheering as if it were a championship game. At union halls, workers replayed her question during lunch breaks, using it as fuel in their own fights for dignity. In immigrant households, parents pointed to Crockett as proof that representation mattered, that one voice could shift an entire conversation. And the GOP? They were left scrambling in the wreckage of their own arrogance. Their carefully curated image of dominance had been punctured by one woman they thought they could dismiss. Instead of walking away as victors, they had become the punchline, the cautionary tale, the embodiment of overconfidence backfiring. What made the aftermath so powerful wasn't just Crockett's question, it was the collective realization that authenticity had prevailed over arrogance, truth over performance. It was the sense that, for once, the system's imbalance had been momentarily corrected, that dignity had won a rare and public victory. But the biggest shockwave was still to come. Because while memes and hashtags made the moment unforgettable, Crockett herself wasn't interested in fleeting internet fame. She saw the moment as a responsibility to channel that viral energy into something lasting. And as the dust settled, one question lingered over the nation: could this moment be more than a headline? Could it be the spark for something bigger? The answer would unfold in what came next. When the noise of the headlines began to fade and the memes slowed their circulation, what remained was the essence of that moment: truth spoken with courage, dignity standing tall against arrogance. Jasmine Crockett's question had done more than embarrass a group of overconfident politicians. It had crystallized a lesson that reached far beyond one hearing, one headline, or one exchange in Washington. At its core, the confrontation was about power: who wields it, who abuses it, and who dares to challenge it. For too long, arrogance had masqueraded as authority. The GOP had perfected the art of drowning out dissent with volume, of disguising hypocrisy with polish. But Crockett revealed what so many had felt but couldn't always articulate: that real power doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from standing firm in truth, even when the odds are stacked against you. Her composure reminded Americans that dignity is not weakness, it is strength. That patience is not passivity, it is strategy. That silence, when wielded with purpose, can be more devastating than any insult hurled across the chamber. In a world addicted to spectacle, Crockett proved that authenticity is the ultimate disruptor. And perhaps the deeper lesson lay in what her opponents failed to understand. By dismissing her as junior, they revealed their fear of the new, their insecurity about change, their resistance to voices that don't fit the mold of Washington tradition. But history has shown, time and again, that the underestimated are often the ones who reshape the world. From immigrant families building futures against all odds, to civil rights leaders dismissed as troublemakers, to women told politics was not their place, progress has always come from those who refuse to accept the labels handed to them. Crockett's moment was a reminder that America's strength has never been rooted in arrogance, but in resilience. Not in exclusion, but in inclusion. Not in silencing, but in amplifying the voices that have been ignored for too long. Her question was more than a challenge to the GOP, it was a message to every ordinary American: your voice matters. Your truth matters. And no amount of bluster can erase that. And so, the moral was clear: arrogance crumbles, but dignity endures. Hypocrisy wavers, but truth resonates. What matters most is not the title beside your name, but the courage inside your heart. As viewers replayed her words, as families talked about the moment at dinner tables, as young leaders felt their own fire ignite, one truth echoed louder than any partisan soundbite: this was about more than politics. It was about the universal human fight for respect, justice, and belonging. And while the chamber may have returned to its routine, the lesson it carried with it could not be undone. Because once a nation sees that arrogance can be dismantled with a single question, it cannot forget it. But Crockett's journey, and the journey of those she represents, was far from over. If one question could rattle the establishment, imagine what could come next. And so, what began as another staged display of GOP arrogance ended as something far greater, a turning point. Jasmine Crockett, dismissed as junior, left the chamber not diminished, but elevated. With one question, she dismantled months of talking points, exposed the hypocrisy of her opponents, and reminded the nation that authenticity will always outshine arrogance. But this moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to every voice that has ever been silenced, every immigrant who has ever been told they don't belong, every young leader told to wait their turn. Crockett's victory was a victory for all who dare to stand up, to question, to challenge power when it seems immovable. And here's the truth: moments like these don't fade. They echo. They ripple outward, fueling conversations, inspiring movements, and planting seeds for the future. What we witnessed wasn't just a debate, it was a declaration that dignity still matters in American democracy. Now the question is, what will we do with it? If you felt the fire of Crockett's words, if you believe truth should never bow to arrogance, if you know that representation matters and that every voice deserves to be heard, then this is your moment too. Don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Share this story. Carry its message into your own circles. Stand with those who refuse to be silenced. Because history isn't written by those who smirk from the sidelines. It's written by those who dare to speak when the world least expects it. This was Jasmine Crockett's mic drop moment. But tomorrow, it could be yours. Subscribe. Share. Stay tuned. The fight for dignity is just getting started.